Thank you all for coming to our panel on the civil rights movement. I'm Bob McCarthy. I'm the chair of the Humanities department here at Key School. I'd just like to ask that you would all silence any cell phones or other electronic devices so that the panel isn't disrupted. I want to start by acknowledging that yesterday was the 46th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And I'd like to ask if we could all just take a brief moment of silence in his honor. Thank you. We have an interesting array of books represented here. They cover a kind of chronology of the civil rights movement. So I guess I'll introduce them in sort of the order of the periods that they cover. Juan Williams' Eyes on the Prize covers the civil rights movement from 1954 to 1965, offering close-ups of the struggles of many of the people who made up the movement. Juan Williams has been a contributor to Fox News Channel since 1997. He's also worked for NPR and the Washington Post and contributed to a wide range of media. This is the 25th anniversary of Eyes on the Prize, which he wrote as a companion piece to the PBS special in 1987. He's written 7 other books on civil rights, the African American experience, and American media. He won an Emmy Award in 1989 and has won a number of awards for his investigative journalism. Todd Purdum's An Idea Whose Time Has Come, Two Presidents, Two Parties, and the Battle for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 takes a close look at the political battles involved in passing the Civil Rights Act of 64, passed 50 years ago this summer, and regarded as one of the most significant legislative achievements of the movement. Todd Purdum spent 23 years at the New York Times as White House correspondent, diplomatic correspondent, and Los Angeles bureau chief, and is now the national editor for Vanity Fair and a senior writer at Politico. And David Chapell's Waking from the Dream, The Struggle for Civil Rights in the Shadow of Martin Luther King, tracks the history of the movement since the death of Dr. King. David Chapell is Rothbaum Professor of Modern American History at the University of Oklahoma. He's also taught in Arkansas, Russia, and upstate New York. Prior to his academic career, he spent time in Washington, D.C. and London doing freelance writing and policy work. In addition to Waking from the Dream, his books include Inside Agitators, White Southerners in the Civil Rights Movement, and A Stone of Hope, Prophetic Religion and the Death of Jim Crow. He's also written numerous articles and essays. So our format today, I'm going to start by asking a few questions for the panelists to discuss, and then we'll switch to audience questions. So when we get to that point, if you have questions, please just go to the microphone in the middle, and you can ask your question to the panelists. And then at about 3:15, we'll move across to the activity building for the book signing. So we'll lead you over there. So I'll start with a question I think all of the panelists could address, but maybe we'll start with Juan because it's drawn from a quote in his book. In Eyes on the Prize, Juan quotes Charles Houston, an early civil rights lawyer, as saying that lawsuits mean little unless supported by public opinion, and the really baffling problem is how to create the proper kind of public opinion. So I'm wondering to what extent the goal of the movement was about shaping public opinion, or was it about legislative and judicial achievements?
Well, I think they're tied together in some very critical way, is that it's a predicate for legislative change, that you have social change, that you have public opinion shift in your favor. And in the case, I would guess I can think of 2 wonderful examples of this. One that I think everyone here would be familiar with is the letter from the Birmingham jail by Dr. King, which is not only written for the New York Times, it appears as an op-ed in the New York Times, but it's also distributed as a pamphlet by Christian groups, civil rights groups, with the intent of changing public perception about the urgency for the need of civil rights protest and civil rights revolution in the country. The argument had been that, gosh, these people are agitators, they're impatient, they don't understand how difficult it is to change this culture. Why do they foment these confrontations that lead to violence? And so here was King, in much the way of any pamphleteer throughout all history, sort of nailing his letter to the church door and appealing for a shift in the way that Americans thought about race, and it proved highly effective. The second example that I would cite for you very quickly it comes from an experience I recently had. It's in Eyes on the Prize, but I just went through this experience recently where a group of congressmen and women went down south, this being 50 years, I guess next year will be 50 years after the freedom rides and all that. And I'm sorry, after Freedom Summer. And we went first to Mississippi. And one of the places we went to visit was the home of Fannie Lou Hamer. And Fannie Lou Hamer might not be known to most of you, but Fannie Lou Hamer was one of the leaders of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And what they were trying to do was dislodge the segregationist, all-white Mississippi Democratic Party from their seats at the 1964 Atlantic City Convention, being held by the Democrats to nominate LBJ. And in the course of this, one of the critical moments was when she testified before the Credentials Committee, and this was on national TV. And you had this woman without much education, really, a generation removed from slavery, testifying about being beaten by people who simply didn't want her to register to vote, and asking what kind of Democratic Party is this, what kind of country is this America? It was so powerful that the President of the United States decided it was going to upset his chances for a peaceful nomination, and he immediately called a press conference at the White House to get the networks to shift their coverage away from Fannie Lou Hamer and to him, and it was successful. But I cite it as evidence of the power of narrative, of presentation, as critical to shifting public opinion in advance of shifting the legislative agenda.
David, would you like to address it next?
Well, I think everybody would say it's both, and I think that every writer, every scholar working on it today would emphasize some aspect of public opinion. I think the consensus, the orthodoxy, really is that social change comes from the grassroots, from the bottom up, and legislation responses from the national state are a response to what brews at the grassroots level. Like most orthodoxies, most conventional wisdoms, that's an oversimplification. Public opinion, I think, tended to mean then northern, white, affluent opinion, the opinion of the New York Times, the opinion of the Washington Post, the opinion of CBS News, et cetera. The conscience of the nation usually meant people in positions of power and influence. It didn't mean opinion, majority opinion in southern states, obviously. But it probably, it aspired to mean at least, majority opinion, and Congress was pressured. I think it's also the case, though, and I think there's many illustrations in the history of the civil rights movement in its golden age, congruent with King's life, as well as later and earlier. There's plenty of instances where a dedicated prophetic minority stands up to take a stand and shifts public opinion. The most obvious example being something that Juan's written about, the Legal Defense Fund, Thurgood Marshall, and other brilliant visionary legal strategists who steered the Supreme Court into really radical change before, I think, public opinion, especially in the South, was anywhere near prepared for it. Martin Luther King at one point said that, we want hearts and minds to change, a broader, deeper conception of public opinion. That's ultimately what we're aiming for, but we'll take structural legal change today if that's what we can get, and we trust that hearts and minds will follow. He reversed the old orthodox equation of conservative social scientists like William Graham Sumner, who said that you can't use the state to change deeply rooted traditions, folkways, stateways,